now that we've been inspired by Susan and learned a lot more about palliative care from Paul, I want to say some practical things, if I can, about what we can do, how we can support people with disabilities, accompany them along that journey. But it's reassuring for me to know that there's so many similarities between palliative care and LARSH. Like, I think it's not really a big leap for us in some ways because the core values are so similar. So, but what is different if the person who is near the end of their life has an intellectual disability? Paul mentioned some of those things, but the first one that kind of comes to my mind is that the person's means of communication and their behavior may be different from some of the rest of us, and so that others may not be familiar. And I think Paul really spoke to how good communication is at the key of palliative care. So that kind of puts the responsibility on us to help people with that. They need it. So it might mean doing something as simple as creating a little bit of a getting a to know you book, you know, so the person takes with them or that they have with them that just sort of tells a little bit about the practical care or things they might need, and some of their likes and dislikes, and maybe some pictures of before they got ill so that people can get to know them. But it is important, though, that there be somebody present, I think, in most situations who knows the person well to help with that communication and the advocacy. There is something that's called Dysdat, which is a disability distress assessment tool, which is something that you would use to sort of gather information about what the person's facial expression or their posture or their vocal signs or habits and behaviors might be if they were in distress. You kind of compare that to what they're like normally, and it takes a long time sometimes to discover that of people. So you can actually sort of fill out this form and have a general idea so that you can help the medical people to know if the person is uncomfortable or maybe in pain, and then they can try to make that next step to help them that Paul was talking about. I have a couple of those at the back for people to just look at if they want. But we do need to help others to understand the language of the person that has a disability. Paul also mentioned end-of-life planning. And I think there's a few extra challenges there for people with disabilities as well, just again, because of the communication and because we just don't want to talk very much about those subjects with people with a disability, maybe. So the planning ahead, though, can make difficult situations a little easier. Obviously, when the person has their family, they would be the ones that would be able to make decisions for them when the person isn't able. But if the person doesn't have family, I think it's really important before they get ill, while they're still healthy, that we try and help them to name that person if they're able, or persons. It could be two people. So I worked out a little bit of a pictorial tool to help people go through that process. And again, that's at the back, but just to say that it's an important thing too, I think, for us to do so that we can respect the person, as Paul was saying. And also something I've done is with people is to talk with them about what they might like for their celebration of life or at their funeral. Again, there's a little pictorial tool there you can look at. But found out that one of my friends wants to be buried in a simple white dress and no shoes, thank you. And it's just kind of great to know that, you know, okay, we can do that for you, you know, that's easy enough. Yeah, so the discussions are particularly important if the person is of a different culture or religion than we are, so that the family and the care providers can work together. The Daybreak community had the privilege, I would say, of accompanying a woman who was dying that was Muslim. And there had been many, many talks with the family. Well, this person, well, she was actually still relatively well. So over time, kind of the discussion had really built up. And so at the end of her life, there was able to be this very wonderful celebration that everybody felt comfortable at. It was something that, you know, her family and friends who were Muslim were able to be there, and something that our community that has a Christian faith base, whatever, was also really able to be there and celebrate. So it doesn't always happen, but the more we talk about it, the more likely it is that something will be able to happen that is good for people. The other thing that we've done is created small circles of support when we see that somebody has become more fragile. So 6 or 8 of the people who know the person well and are significant in their lives will come together, and it's just really to kind of listen to each other about what's been going on with the person, to voice our concerns and ask our questions, and hopefully we can come up with a little bit of an action plan or next steps that would help to support the person and the family. I think the significant thing there is to sort of not be alone in it, but that we're together. And I think it's always good to have somebody who's a little bit of an outside eye and not quite as emotionally involved or as present in the day-to-day there as well, just to provide a little bit of objectivity, because when we're in the situation it can be, well, it's just different. So to just have another perspective. Yeah. I know that when Gordon, a member of our community, was sick, we decided that the right thing to do, we weren't sure what was going to happen, but was to send him to the British Virgin Islands with a friend to visit his mother who lived there. Gord actually died while he was there, but because we had made that decision together, we were all very peaceful with it and actually created quite a lot of unity, and we found ways to celebrate Gord without his body and stuff. But yeah, just not being alone in it, I think, is, if we can, much healthier. Yeah. And there's a number of different factors that come into play when we're trying to provide care for someone, or trying to decide if we're still the right place to be providing care, or whether or not it's become more than what we're able to handle well. So the first of these factors is obviously the prognosis and the health status of the person, which again Paul spoke to a little bit, how there can just be a number of different things happening that we might be more or less comfortable with. A lot of us here, or some of us, have learned how to use feeding tubes, and that's fine, and things like that. But there is some stuff that's beyond kind of our comfort level or just our ability. And there's a little story that I have that illustrates that. Just gradually her ability to swallow got worse. She was choking often, and a nurse was coming to the house twice a day to suction Monique. She gave us his phone number in case she needed him more frequently. It frightened Monique, and it frightened the people who loved her and lived with her. We didn't think we could keep her safe at home because we could not respond to the ever-increasing need for suctioning. So 2 of her sisters talked to the people in Monique's home and to some of us in the community. Together we decided to seek a safe place for Monique, where Monique's needs could be responded to, and she could be safe and comfortable. So that sense of what physically does the person need? And then what's the desire of the person? As much as we know, do they want to stay at home? Do they feel safer somewhere else? Or again, to take that into consideration as much as we can. And the physical environment, obviously, is a really important factor. Is the house wheelchair accessible? Is there another place that is? Is there enough space that if the person's noisy or up at night that they won't keep the whole house awake? And is the house too noisy for the person that's actually ill? There's just sort of a number of questions there to think about too. Those are just some of them. And obviously, there's team considerations of the team, or the circle of support around the person. Just is there strong enough leadership? Does the circle of support or the team need to be increased because the person's needs have increased? And are the people on the team comfortable supporting someone who's dying? For some people it can just be too awaken too much fear that, like Susan was speaking about, or so that they just can't manage it well. And so that's a reality we need to respect. And just, are we able to offer the team the support and the resources and training that they may need? For us, another big factor is the impact on the other people with disabilities that are in the home. I know this doesn't apply to families, but I'm really glad there's families here. I think we've got lots to learn from you. But I think that for us in agencies is a big question, is how's that impacting on the other people? Often it calls out a lot of compassion. I know of one person who sort of started moving his room downstairs so that the person who was ill could, he was moving downstairs so that's, no. He was moving upstairs so that the person who was ill could move downstairs, just kind of, just called out a lot of compassion in that person. And for some people, it might just be scary. And I think because we're so focused on the person who is ill or dying, maybe it's just sort of important for us to kind of be conscious of the other people's behavior, or just the way they're reacting to things and stuff, to try to figure out if it's too stressful a situation for them. The 6 factors that there obviously are going to be probably some financial implications here, unfortunately. That's just the reality. And so we need to kind of consider that, what might be the financial resources that would be needed. And it's important to look at what are the resources outside the family or the agency that can possibly help provide some of the care. Community care, or does Cancer Society provide rides for people having chemo? I'm just trying to find out what other supports are out there, because there's a lot actually if we can tap into them. And again, for communities or agencies, there's that question of being able to maybe support 1 or 2 people who are more fragile, but if a 3rd person all of a sudden develops dementia, it's kind of, is that going to be too much, or how do we kind of look at that situation? So it's kind of just, and one particular time we may be able to do something, but in another not, or, it's just, it's very complicated. And just also what's the emotional health, kind of what have people experienced recently as far as loss. And, So again, those factors quickly were the health status and prognosis of the person, the physical environment, the team, the impact on other people with disabilities, the financial resources outside the agency or family, whether or not there's other needs, and sort of just the general emotional health. So it does get complicated pretty quickly when you start juggling all those factors, so either trying to figure out how to provide care or whether or not the person is able to receive the care that they have at home. And so it doesn't necessarily take a lot to kind of change the situation. So you got a handout that just sort of talks about some of the tipping points, or times when we might want to just stop and look, and assess the situation again as things evolve. But we need to remember too that if the person can't stay at home, that we can bring some of home to them. And that we need to do the best we can, and to continue to be in relationship with the person if they don't stay at the home with us, and not feel too badly about it, as long as we continue the relationship, because that's what we're committed to. So there's just a little quote too from Caring for People with Learning Disabilities Who Are Dying from England. It's just interesting because they say care staff can continue to offer valuable support even if the person needs to move to another setting. So I think it's just important for us to remember that. And I think one of the other factors, or one of the other things that's different for somebody with an intellectual disability, is that they might be receiving care from someplace else. So how do the family and the person and the agency that's been providing care work together? I think it is really, really important for families and agencies to get to know each other as well as they can before the person is ill, so that there's a good relationship that's happening there. And because they're going to have to work together, I think, in some ways to decide, okay, who's the main contacts with the doctors, who's making what decisions and stuff, because it'd be too confusing for the medical people otherwise, or the other people providing care, if they're trying to talk to too many other people. And I also really do think that advocacy is crucial as well, as Paul mentioned, because people with disabilities, their lives are still not always seen as really valuable, and so they're vulnerable. So we may need to advocate for them, as Paul said. And there's an end-of-life care for Persons with Developmental Disabilities paper, and they say that advocating for a full range of end-of-life care choices for people with developmental disabilities, including hospice, pain management, organ donation, the right to have decisions legally recognized, and the option to change their mind regarding end-of-life wishes. So those are just good to kind of keep that in mind. So we need to do what we can to help the person get the best care possible. But this can be very challenging because it's very complicated, and there's never just one thing involved. It's always more than one, so things can change very quickly. I know with one of our people that we were accompanying in the hospital, within kind of 48 hours, we needed to decide 3 different times if we wanted to continue treatment or not. You know, it's not just kind of a one-time thing there, those decisions. So again, need to be there a lot and be talking together and making good choices. And another area that we've found that we did need to advocate for people coming to say goodbye to the person who is ill if they're not at home. You know, it sort of can be really, really important for the person who's dying, obviously, to see their friends, but very important, too, for the friends to be able to go and have that opportunity and take a little card or say a word if they want to. But Henry Nouwen wrote a little story about that in one of his books. The book was Adam. So this chapter is about, or this section is just when Adam was dying at the hospital. So meanwhile, all the people of Daybreak heard the news that Adam was dying, and those in Adam's day program had gathered in the meeting hall, preparing to come in shifts to bid Adam goodbye. Each person in the program has severe limitations, so the assistants were discussing who would go first in the wheelchair van and who would wait until 11 a.m. They agreed that Tracy and Michael would go first. So they began to get their coats and wheelchairs, not noticing that Rosie, who was scheduled to go for a later run, had already toddled out, gotten her coat half on, and pushed her wheelchair in front of the entrance of the hall. Rosie, like Adam, doesn't speak. She learned to walk at the age of 25 after living many years in a crib in a nursing home. Rosie never gets very close to people, and she often screams for no apparent reason. She seems to live in a world apart. But she taught Liska, who is here, how to communicate. So Liska spoke at her homily and talked, or at her when Rose died, Liska talked about Rosie and teach. So just to say, there's a whole other Rosie too that's not here in this paper. But when Tracy and Michael were both ready to leave, there was Rosie in her wheelchair blocking the entrance. Kathy gently lifted her out of it, saying that she'd have to wait a bit, that she was going at 11. So she took her back into the meeting hall and moved the chair back as well. On her way out, the phone rang, so she stopped to answer it. When she returned 2 minutes later, who was blocking the entrance, sitting in her wheelchair? Rosie. Kathy asked her, "Rosie, are you trying to tell us something?" She waited, and when Kathy went to help her back into the meeting hall, she clung to her chair. "Maybe you need to go now, Rosie, but you can't make your loud noises if you go to the hospital. Because Adam's very, very sick and we're going to say goodbye. And if you start making your loud noises, they'll ask us to all leave, and the others won't be allowed to come. What do you think?" So Rosie held tight to her chair. It was as if she was saying, "Please, I want to go now." And the nurses, as well as the family, were uncertain about a parade of people coming into Adam's room to bid him farewell. But for the sake of the people, they allowed it. Rosie, well warned about her noises, was wheeled into the room and up beside Adam's bed. Silently, she looked into Adam's eyes. He appeared to look back. She reached out and took his hand, something that no one had ever seen her do. And she held his hand and looked into his eyes for almost 2 minutes. Gently, she laid his hand back on the bed and leaned back in her chair, ready to go. Rose and Adam had said farewell to one another. Rosie was ready to leave. She'd been present to Adam. So the depth of the relationship between Adam and Rose reminds us to honor and respect the relationships that may exist between people with disabilities. And the story also illustrates how well Kathy knew Adam and Rose. So once again, the importance of having people with whom we have long-term relationships and who know us well can't be overstated. Very important. And palliative care also includes grief support afterwards, or as the person is dying, for the person and the family. That grief support is a significant part of palliative care too, I think. And again, we don't necessarily sort of think about people with disabilities grieving, but obviously they do. But how to sort of support them and stuff is actually kind of a whole other evening of conversation. But just to say that we need to grow kind of in our awareness that people are grieving and helping them along that journey as well. The grief journey is much the same for all of us actually, but there are some kind of concrete things that we might do that would be helpful for people that also are very helpful for most of us. But in conclusion, I'd just like to read a couple things. One of them is a paragraph from the Large Ontario Vision Statement of supporting members with intellectual disabilities as they age and die, and I've handed that out to you as well, so that, but I just picked one paragraph from that. We've discovered that relationships of mutuality between those with a labeled disability and those who support them can become even deeper as they age, experience dementia, or are dying. We know these relationships are lived not only with considerable pain, but also with considerable personal transformation. They can be a tremendous witness to the healing power of love revealed in the vulnerability of loss. The witness has deeply touched the lives of our communities, families, friends, and many in the wider community. And the second quote is from one of the eulogies at Alia's memorial. So someone said, "On the morning of Alia's death, we gathered here at the chapel to tell some stories and to pray. We heard a story taken from the morning, shortly before Alia died. A nurse entered Alia's room through the crowd of family and friends that surrounded her, and the nurse asked, 'What was Alia's career?' And Bila, Alia's brother, looked around the room, motioned his hand at those who were gathered, and replied, 'This was her career.' So Alia's career, her vocation, was there in her final gathering, family and friends together, drawn in by Alia's presence. Alia's presence, it was her vocation, it was her gift to all of us, and she offered it to us in so many ways. Her presence gathered us. She gathered us in her spirited presence, with her spirited presence, gathered us in peaceful stillness, and she gathered us in her darkest moments of suffering. So I believe that people with intellectual disabilities gather us together and call us to unity by being who they are. And when they're dying or more fragile, this ability to gather us and bring us together is even stronger. So encourage us to not be afraid, but to be committed in supporting people as well as we're able as they make this final journey.